Okay, thank you very much, and happy to be here. Just a little bit of a intro, little comment. Several years ago, I was invited to give a plenary talk at a major societal conference, and it was to be on this topic of LNT. And as it turns out, being one of the plenary discussions. The society was very kind. They offered to pay my way and then have me stay there for the whole 4 or 5 days so that plenary talk is given the first day. And so you can get feedback and have a lot of discussion with people who would be attending that opening session. And so then, so I agreed to do it. And then about 6 weeks later, somebody from the committee called me and disinvited me from giving the plenary talk, and told me that there had been some administrative glitch and somehow my invitation and my presentation wasn't going to take place. And so since I've been around kind of a goodly number of years and given a few plenary talks but many others, it just didn't really make too much sense to me. So I pressed them for, something beyond, some administrative glitch. I really wanted an answer. And so a different person called me back and kind of gave me a somewhat different answer, but it was still, kind of an administrative glitch. And so then I decided to call a number of people who were influential in that society, and that created a certain amount of angst. And so then someone called me back and said that, gave me a third answer and basically told me that absolutely my continuing to probe for an answer wasn't going to change the decision that I was not going to speak. And that was it. And so I had never been really disinvited before from from any meeting, let alone, from a plenary presentation. Then about 4 months ago, I got a telephone call from a person that I knew was high up in that society and was on that committee that decided to invite the speakers. And so that person wanted some information from me. And I said, well, let's have a little exchange of information. I said, I'll certainly give you what you want. I said, but you have to just answer one question. And the question was, tell me how I got disinvited from giving the plenary talk at that conference. And so he told me that what happened was that I was the first plenary speaker invited. But then when they invited the second one, the second person, who was really quite prominent, I'm sure that you would know the person's name, decided that they would not go on the same you might say platform as me, and would absolutely not speak if I was to speak. And so the committee got together and they decided that they wanted the other speaker more than me. So in effect, I was disinvited. So I hate to say that you're getting really second best today, but as it turns out, I think that I've learned a lot in the last couple of years, and so the talk that I'm going to give today is actually going to be a far better one than they would have got 2 or 3 years ago. But I wanted you to know a little bit of the impediments or the challenges that you encounter when you challenge the basic belief that has ruled the roost, so to speak, ruled this field of cancer risk assessment. So when you challenge the dogma, they find different ways to take you down. I have to say that being kicked out of being able to give a plenary talk in front of really multiple thousands of people, kind of hurt. But on the Richter scale, it was about a 2 for me. Because high up on the Richter scale is when they really try to fire you from your job, and I've had that too, and so that's a lot higher on the Richter scale. So, but I've had a lot that have been in between those two extremes as well. So I want you to just kind of get a feel that And as I think most of you know, that when we challenge the basic beliefs that life gets exciting. And so then we'll jump into essentially I think an exciting tale of LNT and its historical foundations. By the way, I'll tell you in terms of which society and which person who didn't want to speak with me and so forth. All that will be ultimately revealed in good time. Not in this talk, but at some other point down the road. So, but I wanted you to at least know that story. So this talk is going to be on the historical foundations of the linear non-threshold dose response model for cancer risk assessment. And it's a story really taking a look at how LNT was born and sustained. And in my view, this basic policy that the US government has had for many decades and ultimately around the world, this is a story of mistakes, deceptions, and failed public policy. And really, if you want to take a look at how this came to be, it's really going to be influenced by Herman Muller, the Nobel Prize winner in 1946. Muller has had a very big influence on the field of risk assessment, cancer risk assessment, radiation, health, and evaluation. And even though he's been dead a long time, his influence is as strong now probably as it ever was. And so Muller becomes famous because he becomes the first to induce gene mutation with an external, you might say external inducer. In his case, it was ionizing radiation. And that's what he ultimately gets his Nobel Prize for 19 years later. He basically publishes his paper in 1927 in the journal Science. And what I'm going to be showing you here is that, or at least concluding, is if you go back in and look at what Muller did he actually induce gene mutation? No, he actually didn't. He did the equivalent of shooting his chromosomes and his fruit flies with really the equivalent of a molecular bazooka, which was giving exposures of his Drosophila to an ionizing radiation exposure that was really about basically 95 million times, and I mean million times greater than background. It was really a pretty phenomenal exposure. And in doing so, he induced mostly massive gene deletions. And many notable geneticists at the time disputed Muller on the topic and later, and trying to show significant limitations to his argument. And Muller was very defensive. He's also very aggressive in his debates, and wouldn't mind, basically really challenging any opponent in any particular way to win his argument. Now, Muller will ultimately be proven wrong that he induced gene mutation when modern technology came around, when you can actually measure nucleotide measurements, and people went back and did the studies and actually showed that what he did was induce massive gene deletion. And so basically his great discovery of gene mutation really wasn't a discovery of gene mutation, and it really wasn't so great. And actually Muller never deserved his Nobel Prize because he got it for something that he actually didn't discover. And so many people before Muller had induced transgenerational phenotypic changes by inducing massive chromosomal changes and reconnecting of chromosomes, and with surviving offspring ultimately seeing changes, phenotypic changes in the next generation. And that even Muller knew that wasn't significant at the time. But when Muller wrote his paper, he called his findings the artificial transmutation of the gene, and he really emphasized the gene. Now Muller, I'm not sure about you, but Muller, even though his research that would lead to his Nobel Prize was not dose response oriented. He got a couple of students after his publication to do his version of a dose response relationship, and they also chose very high doses, used 4 doses in their particular studies, and showed a linear dose response relationship. These were massively high doses, but with those 2 studies, Muller basically made the decision that the dose response was linear, and linear for ionizing radiation and mutation, and basically with that, in 1930, Muller really created the LNT concept, and he didn't use LNT as a term. He used the term proportionality dose response, and called really proportionality rule. So this was the basic rule for dose response, that the dose response was linear all the way down to a single ionization. And this phrasing essentially enters the literature in the 1930s. It didn't really have wide distribution, but it was picked up and used predominantly by radiation geneticists. Now, Muller went to Germany in 1933 with a Fulbright, and while he was there, he was studying or researching with this guy Timofey Mrzowski, and who was a geneticist, a Russian geneticist in Berlin, and in collaboration with two physicists and using some of Muller's data, they created really a significant new development. They actually added a mechanism to Muller's linear dose response relationship based upon radiation target theory. And with this, they created what would be called really the single hit LNT model. They basically showed in their modeling that a single hit mechanism was mathematically could account for the features of the LNT, and thus they integrated a mechanism with a dose response. But the problem with this approach was that it was really wrong from the start, because Muller actually never induced gene mutation, and so they were modeling something that was far from a gene mutation. Now, basically what happened with Muller during this time period is that he had some serious challenges. Challenges to his LNT interpretation, challenges to the fact that, to the assumption that he had induced gene mutation. And this was coming from some of his peers. And what happened was that this, the challenge really came out of genetic cytology work in the area of corn. And this lady who would get a Nobel Prize later, Barbara McClintock, was essentially doing work with staining chromosomes. And she was staining chromosomes in corn and getting a really much improved resolution in terms of being able to see chromosomal structure, and especially during different phases of mitosis and meiosis. And when she observed the effects of let's put it this way, ionizing radiation on corn, she saw basically that when corn was exposed to ionizing radiation, and people thought that they were inducing gene mutation, that she saw with her refined staining that they were actually knocking large holes in the chromosomes. And the person who did that work was a guy by the name of Louis Statler, who was a professor, a pretty well-known professor at the University of Missouri. And McClintock was there also, working with him as another faculty member. And Statler had been a real challenger to Muller. In fact, when Muller published his paper in Science in 1927, Statler was only 3 months behind him with his corn work, showing really the same thing, that radiation could induce gene mutations in corn. But when McClintock was working with Statler after that fact, she told him that based upon her analyses of his chromosomes that had been exposed to radiation, that what he thought were gene mutations were anything but gene mutations. They were actually just large deletions of genetic material that were recombining. And Statler didn't like it. He thought she was wrong. He resisted, and then about a month or so later, he ultimately gave in and came to the conclusion that God, I guess I wasn't inducing gene mutation. Then he basically came to the conclusion, well, if I wasn't inducing gene mutation, then maybe Muller wasn't. And then that led to him basically checking with some other associates, showing his data, getting some confidence behind him, and then finding the appropriate time to challenge Muller in Muller's interpretation that he'd induced gene mutation. And he chose, a plenary talk, believe it or not, at the 6th International Genetics Congress that was held at Cornell University. And two of the people who were chosen to be plenary speakers, and they both agreed to speak at the same platform. Maybe they won't after this presentation, however, presentation they gave in 1932, because that was when Statler stood up to give his presentation. He went and he explained to the group that Muller, when he reported that he had induced gene mutation in 1927, had not induced gene mutation. That what Muller had actually done was he had just blown large holes in the chromosomes. And in fact, what Muller did wasn't new at all. And so this created, you can just imagine that. Just picture yourself in the audience and you're Muller. And here's this guy Statler coming up and basically telling you what you became famous for was basically not what actually happened. And so this led to an incredible uproar at the conference. Muller was particularly emotionally upset with it all. It led to him having, he's going through a terrible divorce at the time. He had some other academic issues. He tried to commit suicide. He was unsuccessful due to getting the dose wrong, actually, with the barbiturate he was taking, thank goodness. And he went to Germany. And ultimately, that's where he met up with this the German Russian group and physicists coming up with this single hit model. But he was actually taken to the cleaner, so to speak, with the work of Statler. Statler and Muller are both very smart guys, excellent research and very bright and really scientifically went through a major chess match with them, fighting over the very point that Statler had challenged him on, that he had not induced gene mutation. And so, and I followed all their articles and their grant proposals and each move they made over the next decade or so. And even though they were really the top of their field and clearly the best, Statler, in my opinion, was somewhat better than Muller in how he designed his experiments. A little sharper, a little crisper, a little more definitive, and over a series of papers that they both did in these chess moves, Statler really had backed Muller into a corner by the end of the 1930s. And when Muller was over in Europe, he ultimately, without getting into his life history, he made it to the University of Edinburgh, and he needed to come up with a way to try to get Statler off his back, actually, and to try to somehow go back to seeing if he could reestablish this, that he had gene mutation and his support for a linear dose response. And he came up with he didn't really smart man that he was, he didn't want to keep losing in his battle with Statler, so he had to come up with a new approach, and he did. And his new approach was, well, maybe we could get at this question by studying something called dose rate. And Muller was of the opinion that mutational damage was cumulative. And that is, every single exposure, every little bit of damage could not be repaired. And it was like a piggy bank. If you put pennies in it, it would just add up penny after penny after penny, or damage after damage after damage. And ultimately would string out to be a linear dose-response relationship. And Muller felt that he wanted to see if that would be true, and he wanted to compare it with what would happen if you gave a lower dose over time. What would actually, would there be any difference between the damage if you gave all the dose at one time, or you gave the same dose, but just titrated out over a much longer period of time? Muller said there's no difference between the two. It's all going to add up to the same number of mutations, genetic damage. So we got a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh to do a study that would look at this question, total dose versus dose rate, using the Drosophila. And what happened was that the student came back and actually supported Muller's hypothesis. And this gave Muller great hope, because what it did was allowed him to essentially go back to his cumulative dose response situation, which ultimately supported his linearity interpretation, and ultimately at low doses would have supported his gene mutation theory. Now, as it turns out, this student's dissertation, I've gone into this and really in as much detail as I think one could possibly go into, and that is, I've gotten the not only the dissertation, I got all the comments by the reviewers, by the committee. I got the letters between the student and the committee, between Muller and the student over time, and tried to dig into this as much as possible. And this student's work, I've published a number of papers on it, and its study had really profound limitations, many technical limitations, and surprisingly, Muller and the other committee members really didn't bring them out. And the first person to bring them out in the literature is actually me. And worse than all is that I found that in the data of the student, that they actually withheld data and altered the research record, and Muller was aware of it based upon exchanges. So Muller's deviation in terms of honesty, to me, was first seen in this student's dissertation and publication. Now, but Muller was going to use this finding to support his quest to be the first to induce gene mutation, but also ultimately to support LNT. Now, what happens after, in the late 1930s, is World War II, and Muller makes it back from Europe to the United States and makes it back to the town that I live in, which is Amherst, Massachusetts. His house was really 1 mile away from where I'm sitting right now. And he, while he was back at Amherst, he got employed as a consultant to the Manhattan Project, working at the University of Rochester with a famous geneticist, Drosophila geneticist by the name of Kurt Stern. And what he did was he convinced Stern that the research with Drosophila should be essentially an expanded version of what the graduate student did out at Edinburgh over the last year or two. And Stern agreed to that. And so this is what's going to happen. Now, to make this happen, it was going to be basically a dose rate versus cumulative dose test again. Now, in the case of Charles, he was studying mice, and they used as many as 400,000 mice, and they never published a single meaningful paper from the entire work with the mammalian model, nothing. And my understanding of why that happened was that this Dr. Charles was very impossible to please researcher, a very excellent person in many ways, but very frustrating to those who worked around him. And I have a number of letters and complaints and everything else about just impossible to get this guy to do something. And ultimately, no publications that came out were meaningful. Ultimately, in 1954, he commits suicide in a Manhattan hotel room himself and left a pretty tragic letter. Now, in the case of Stern's research, it was very significant. And ultimately, it's going to be the findings from that Stern's research with Muller as his consultant that's going to affect our scientific beliefs and national policy on dose response to the present time. Now, how this was set up in this biggest and best of testing this hypothesis was they got they had very good people. They had two outstanding PhDs in insect physiology who were working with Stern and Muller and others, and they had technical support. And it's going to be done the right way, you might say, as compared to the student working by himself with Muller never around out in Edinburgh. And so they were going to do an acute exposure. It's going to be led by this guy, Warren Spencer, working with Stern. And they were going to give acute doses of ionizing radiation to Drosophila. And they were going to essentially give all the dose at one time, but different doses of radiation. And in this study, they showed a linear dose response relationship. And it was very what these researchers had expected to find. They saw a linear dose response. Now, if you go into the research of Spencer, based upon the published record, and I have, once again, all the communication between Muller and Spencer and Muller and Stern and whatever else was going on that, and all their backup records. And you find that there were very serious problems with this Spencer research. They had very poor temperature control, very inconsistent instrument calibration. They didn't match controls on and treatment animals on the same experimental days. They even, surprisingly, hard to believe this, they even combined the treatment of the same total dose but different dose rates, that which they were really trying to even study. And they combined it in a way that would have made the study totally unacceptable. But nobody highlighted or brought up these criticisms. And then they had other weaknesses. And the crazy thing is that my criticisms of this study are the first criticisms that are ever reported in the literature, decades after this. Now, but the key experiment in this Manhattan project was going to be the chronic study, where you took the same total dose and you spread it out over the entire life of the fruit fly, which was to be done by this other PhD, Ernst Caspari, and it's done at about 1/13,000th of the rate at which the lowest dose that Spencer gave. And but the damage that Spencer reported, Muller and the other people predicted that Caspari would see the same amount of damage because all the damage was cumulative. So it really didn't make any difference if you spread it out over their whole life or gave it all at one time. The damage should be the same if total dose is to be correct. And so as it turns out, Caspari does his experiment, comes in with the data and shows it to Kurt Stern. And guess what? He says, Dr. Stern, Kurt, whatever he called him, I didn't see any damage. There was a threshold in this finding. And so they got upset because when they gave the dose all at one time, they showed damage. But when you took that same dose and you spread it all the way out throughout the entire lifespan of the fruit fly, it did not deviate from what the unexposed control showed. And so this was very upsetting because ultimately it was challenging this LNT concept. And so, so what does Stern do? Stern tells Caspari that he doesn't accept his interpretation. he basically said that the reason why you didn't see the reason why you saw a threshold and not a linear dose response was that your control group was reading aberrantly high. And if it was reading aberrantly high, then you're not going to see the linear dose response. And so he said, so back in your face, I don't accept what you have to say. And so I'll give Caspari credit. He dug into the literature, came up with a number of studies using the same model and looking at background mutation and so forth, and found that his control group indeed was exactly right in the middle of where the literature said it should be, and that Stern's challenge that his control group was aberrantly high was refuted. And so, and I have, this is all done in memorialized in memos, multiple memos between these people. So it's all in their writing. And Stern backs down in writing as well. And so I give Stern credit for actually doing that. Now, you might think that the story's over and we're going to support a threshold. Well, that's not really what actually happened next. And this is when life becomes a little bit more interesting here. So Stern, he's a believer in LNT. Muller's a believer. They're all a believer in LNT. This is a bit of an ideological perspective for them. So how do they actually go forward on this? How would you go forward on this if you were Stern? Well, I don't know what you would do, but this is what he did. Stern decided that he was going to suppress the significance of the threshold findings. And how would he do that? Well, in the discussion of the paper, they said that the data should not be accepted until it could be determined why the responses that Caspari showed were not linear. That is, why did it disagree with the Spencer findings? And they said, and until we can find why it disagrees with the Spencer acute study, then the data should not be used. And you might say, well, and this is when you take a look at the two studies, the Spencer study had a lot of methodological problems with it, as I briefly summarized for you. But if you look at the Caspari study, he didn't have any of those issues. The reason why he wasn't that he was a better researcher than Spencer, was because he did it a year after him, and they got all the bugs worked out, I think. And so they calibrated their instrument. The temperature was better. Everything was done better in the Caspari version. And so what you have here is basically Stern saying that I'm not going to challenge the Spencer work. I'm going to challenge the Caspari work because it disagreed with the Spencer work. And so you might say, well, gee, how could he ever get this paper published, if you send it to a journal and says, here's my data, but don't actually use it until we can figure out why it differed from this other study. And it was a straw man. Because there were 25 methodological differences between his study, Caspari's, and Stern's study and Spencer's study. They were never really going to figure out why they truly differed from each other. But it was ultimately to kill this concept of a threshold. And so the journal that he actually sent it to, well, what journal would it be that would accept, somebody saying this about their data? Oh, it was the Journal of Genetics, where Kurt Stern was the editor-in-chief. So he sent it to his own journal, and he sent it out on, November 25th, 1947, about 60-page, 70-page manuscript. And it was published in the first week in January. I doubt that it was ever peer-reviewed. He gave Caspari a publication, a meaningless one at that. And that's what actually ends up happening. But to make the story interesting here, the data shows a threshold. But in September of 1946, Muller's told that he gets the Nobel Prize. So Muller makes his trip to Stockholm and gives his Nobel Prize acceptance speech on December 12th, 1946. And in that presentation, he ultimately says that the threshold model is dead. It has no standing, and we have to switch to a linear dose-response relationship. And he was really firm about this. And I said, well, gee, if Muller's that convinced, then could he have seen the CASPARI data? He couldn't have seen the CASPARI data, because if he did, he'd have known that there was a possibility that there was a threshold. And so he just couldn't have seen the CASPARI data. I said, but did he? So then I asked many people, did they know, didn't they know? Nobody could figure it out. So I bought all the correspondence between Muller and all these people during that time period. And ultimately sitting at this computer one day, it all came in electronically. And sure enough, I find that on November 6, 1946, Stern sends a letter to Muller with the data set, the paper, and asking him to evaluate all the CASPARI work. And Muller writes back the smoking gun on November 12, 1946, in which he says, I see the CASPARI work. It challenges linearity. It's a good study. He's a good researcher. You've got to get more money to test this thing. I will give you a deeper report before I make my next trip to Europe, which was going to actually be his Nobel Prize speech. So I knew right then and there that Muller had actually seen the challenge to LNT, and that he thought sufficiently of it to tell. And what he should do is to tell Stern he's got to replicate this work. And so then what happens is that Muller doesn't get his critique before his Nobel Prize speech, and he shows up at his Nobel Prize speech. And what does he do? Just like I mentioned to you before, he goes and he just blows the threshold right out of the water, that it has no standing, it has nothing behind it anymore. You have to shift. But I knew that he had seen the CASPARI data. And the CASPARI data was the best study to date, for sure. So I'm saying to myself, well, if I had, be so lucky to get a Nobel Prize, and I was Muller at that time, what would I have said? And I said, well, what I would have said, I'm a believer in LNT. I'd have got up and I'd say, perhaps that in fact, I strongly support, what is the nature of the dose response in the low dose zone for radiation, for mutation? I think it's a linear dose response. I strongly believe that. However, the issue is unresolved. It needs further study, and we'll see what actually happens. Was that what he said? No, that's not what he said. He goes and he says there was no possibility, when in fact he knew not only was there a possibility, that he had seen data contradicting it, and it was the finest study to date. So in my opinion, Muller at his Nobel Prize speech, not only did he not induce gene mutation to get the Nobel Prize, but when he was speaking in Stockholm, he actually lies to the audience. He's a very deceptive man, and deceptive at the national, at international level, and you have to wonder. Why would he do this? I mean, he was afraid of being caught, afraid of nothing. I mean, what kind of person would do this, right? So he used his Nobel Prize lecture to demand the rejection of the long-standing threshold model, and LNT should replace basically the threshold. So this lecture received just enormous publicity, influenced regulators, the media, and the scientific community on public health concerns with ionizing radiation, even at low doses. And it was all based upon deception. And so essentially, as we know, prior to his Nobel Prize lecture, Muller knew of the threshold supporting study by CASPARI. It's the strongest study to date. And he recognized the challenge, and he wanted that study replicated. And when Muller now, after the Nobel Prize, he come on January 14th, 1947, so a month after he gives his Nobel Prize lecture, when he writes, he's got, essentially 6-page, 7-page analysis of the CASPARI work. And he finds no technical issues with this paper. And the letter exchanges indicate that Muller's views were similar 5 weeks before as they were 5 weeks after his Nobel Prize. So basically, following the internal review by Muller and CASPARI, they published their paper, and the only things that really changed was they removed the threshold conclusion and they added Muller's name to the acknowledgments. Now, I'll give Stern credit. He got money and he wanted to replicate the study, just like Muller told him. So World War II is over. Spencer and Caspari went their own ways to their academic jobs, and Stern made use of a new graduate student by the name of Delta Uphoff, a master's student, and she was to replicate the work of Caspari. And so in her first big experiment, and she was to do 3, what happened was that she experienced a very, very low control group value. And it was about 40 or 50% below what the literature and what Caspari had. And so they had to write up a manuscript that they sent to the Atomic Energy Commission, which was their funding group. And they in the writing up of it, what happened is they referred to their data as being uninterpretable due to the low control group value. So they basically didn't know how to interpret their data. They felt that it was flawed. And so in this paper, it was very interesting in the discussion. Stern blamed the low control group of Uphoff's replication on investigator bias. Right in the discussion said the low control groups were due to investigator bias. And what did he mean by that? Or what did her name's on that paper? What did they mean by this? Who was biased? Was it Delta? Was it Stern? Was it the whole group? When did the bias begin? When did the bias end? It's a mystery. But what is not a mystery is that they called these data uninterpretable, and they blamed it on bias within their own group. And this happened on several occasions. The second experiment ended just the same way the first one did, with the acknowledgement basically. And all this material nobody saw because these papers were classified as classified publications within the Atomic Energy Commission. And so there was a third experiment that was done, and it had a normal control, but it's supposed to be a linear dose response to fit their pattern, and the response was somewhere around 3 to 5 times higher than what a linear dose response would have shown. And so the data were actually all over the place, and Stern was coming out of this experience with essentially nothing very usable. So now what he did was he more or less pulled the scientific rabbit out of the hat, and he decided to do a meta-analysis of these 5 experiments. That's the Caspari Stern one. The Spencer Caspari one, the 3 by Uphoff, into 5 little project experiments, although there was a lot of work in each of them. But what happened was that the Delta Uphoff work, which was uninterpretable and basically based upon investigator bias, research bias, he revived it, and he took away his criticism, never told anybody that he criticized it in the first place, added these 5 studies together, but he then went back and relabeled the Caspari study invalid because of a high control group, which was not true. And he then combined these other studies together and claimed that there was a linear dose response. And this meta-analysis was published in a 1-page table report in the journal Science, lacking all methodological details and other supporting information. And he and Uphoff, who co-published the paper, they claimed that they would provide all these details in a subsequent publication, but they never did. Now, the interesting thing is that then various rumors were circulated that the Caspari study was, the threshold study was marginalized because the control group was aberrantly high, and it was really very false rumors. And I'd have to tell you that as it turns out, Muller was doing a work to try to fight off the challenges of Louis Statler at that time, and had a massive amount of control group data himself. And Stern wrote to him for his data. Who was right? Was it the Uphoff data? Was it the CASPARI data? And in the very definitive letters to Stern, which I have in this room in my files, Mueller says that the CASPARI data match up very much with his, not Uphoff. So he didn't support Uphoff at all in these private letters. And this was during the 1940s, mid 1946. But when he went later to the University of Indiana, his same published work was still very supportive of CASPARI and consistent with his own earlier work. The weird thing with this is that if you follow Mueller, in the 1950s, he publishes a number of papers, and he repeatedly and inexplicitly challenged the CASPARI findings, claiming in writing that CASPARI's control group values were aberrantly high. Yet the data of Mueller, both before and after the CASPARI paper, fully supported the CASPARI interpretation. And so why would Mueller make such knowingly false comments and do so repeatedly and do it in the literature? And people who would have known these things would have been certainly Stern and Spencer and Uphoff and CASPARI. Nobody ever spoke up and said a word. And they were probably afraid of this guy because he could be a pretty vicious man. So why would he make these comments? It's speculative, but to support LNT, and if he made these probably to also to protect his reputation, because I'm sure he knew that he lied at his Nobel Prize speech. So in the subsequent decade, early part of the 50s, Stern published the highly acclaimed genetics textbook with multiple editions. He claimed that the data of Uphoff and Spencer provided the basis for a linearity interpretation, totally ignoring CASPARI's findings. So this sets things up really for the first National Academy of Sciences genetics panel, which was to address issues dealing with what do we know about low doses of radiation. And this genetics panel, when it came to be in November of 1956, the situation was that the US government and other governments around the world were supporting still a threshold dose response model. Now, this committee changed the whole way that we think, and they recommended the adoption of the LNT model for ionizing radiation-induced genomic mutation, and they rejected the threshold model. Now, the interesting thing here was that this panel was put together by the Rockefeller Foundation, and it funded the National Academy of Sciences to undertake this assessment. It just so happened that the president of the National Academy of Sciences, Detlef Bronk, was also the president of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which becomes soon thereafter Rockefeller University. And he was also on the board of the foundation for the Rockefeller Foundation. And so it was like, the Rockefeller Foundation gave money to their own person, and they chose basically the genetics panel. And prior to this time, there really wasn't a genetics panel. Geneticists had been part of medical panels, and usually one or two per medical panel. Usually would always, if they supported the LNT, they'd always be outvoted by the medical panel at that time. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation had funded essentially all the leading academic geneticists, radiation geneticists in this country. And they knew their beliefs, they knew what they stood for and everything else. And so they basically chose a hand-picked panel to be this first ever biological effects of atomic radiation, the Bear-1 genetics panel. And in the very first early meetings of this panel, one of the members, Tracy Sornabon from the University of Indiana, he went and gave the radiation mantra, their Apostles' Creed, read it right into the recorded conversation transcripts files of that panel. And what they believed in essentially was that all doses are cause harm. No doses, no damage is repairable, nothing's reversible. And when you add those three together, the damage becomes cumulative, and the dose response is linear all the way down to a single ionization. They read that into this belief into the record, and early on, it was not debated, it was not challenged. I had thought that there would have been a great debate over what the nature of the dose response in the low dose area was, and I was hoping to see a debate. But these radiation geneticists, they all thought alike. There was no diversity of opinion. It was as if essentially the plaintiff or the defense could choose the jury and not the other. And nobody could be challenged. These were chosen. They essentially handpicked people with predetermined beliefs, and one knew what the answer was going to be, and they were going to actually all go. It was going to go linear very early in the game. Now, basically, something else happened in this process as well, and that is that one of the members, whose name was Jim Neal, he was in charge of a 10-year study, and he kept on for a lot longer than that. He's a University of Michigan professor. And it was to assess the effects of the atomic bomb on genetic damage in children of atomic bomb survivors. And they studied over 10 years, up by November of 1955. They had been studying birth defects and other genetic changes in 75,000 children that had been born to people who had been exposed to the atomic bomb. And what happened was that in this study, where they had thousands of employees, many staff, the two countries working together to try to do the study correctly, and it was a good study. And what they found was, in fact, no evidence of any genetic damage in these 75,000 people that they were studying. And so this was pretty amazing, actually. I mean, people would have thought, my goodness, all kinds of genetic damage should have been shown. There was high exposures, low to high exposures taking place, and they didn't find any documentable damage. And so Jim Neal brings this nearly 300-page report that is just completed right to the first meeting of the Bear 1 genetics panel. And Muller stood up at the panel, and he basically led the group in deciding that this data should not have professional standing, and they decided not to consider it. And Jim Neal is right there. He is on the panel. And so what happened was that, now this is hard to believe that I'm not sure anybody else knew this. I've been working on LNT for many years, and it wasn't until about 18 months ago that I came to this discovery for myself that, in fact, that this Bear 1 panel gave no standing to this atomic bomb casualties mutational study that their own member was the director of, and it had no impact. So what they did was, rather than basing their evaluation on human data, or largely on human data, they decided to base it principally on the fruit fly. Now, Neal, if you picture Neal secretly gives his report to the British, because they have a contemporary British genetics panel going on as well. And their panel embraced his, thought that it was a very powerful and strong study, and it had a major impact on their report, totally different than what was recommended by the US. And so essentially what happened was that several other weird things happened. And that was that by the time the second meeting was over, it was clear that they knew the results were going to favor an LNT. And so, but as a committee, they had enough money for 7 or 8 meetings, and they had to have meetings. So So the person in charge of the group, the chairman, decided to give some make work to their geneticist. And this was actually proved to be an amazing thing, because he asked them to estimate the number of birth defects that would happen in the U.S. population in the first year if they were given a certain genetic gonadal dose, and follow it out for 10 years. And gave each of the geneticists 1 month to write up their results. They had 12 geneticists on the panel at the time, and 3 of the panelists thought that it was too much uncertainty and refused to do it. But 9 decided to offer comments, and within 1 month, all 9 comments were provided and done independently. And they thought this was a good idea, because the geneticists essentially were all kinds of geneticists. There was a Drosophila geneticist, and there were, paramecia geneticists, mouse geneticists, population geneticists, and so forth. All kinds of geneticists. And they felt, well, if we could come up with, if all these different geneticists kind of agreed with each other, then that would add great strength to any interpretation. It just so happened that when the data all were sent in, and I have copies of all the nine presentations here in this office as well, they profoundly disagreed with each other all over the lot. And so the person who was collating the information essentially notified the chairman that there was so much variability and so much uncertainty that nobody would believe what they would have to say, because they couldn't agree amongst themselves. And so on his own, and his name was Dr. James Crow from the University of Wisconsin, on his own, he decided to remove the 3 lowest estimates. And by removing the 3 lowest estimates, he reduced the uncertainty considerably. But now he only had six estimates, and it brought down the uncertainty down to about 750-fold.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Jeremy. Just so we have a 5-minute warning here. We're up against a little bit of a time crunch here, so just a 5-minute warning. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. And so what happened is that they decided to reduce the uncertainty without documenting it down to 100-fold. And so what we have here is when the paper was published in the Journal of Science by this committee, what you have is, in fact, this write-up said that the uncertainty that this group reported was in fact a 100-fold uncertainty factor, and that our geneticists came to be, and they felt that was a reasonable amount of uncertainty. And so when I'm reading this paper, what I find is that they said that we challenged our geneticists to figure out what the estimate was, and 6 took up the challenge. Yet I knew that there were 9. And so somehow in that science presentation, what happened is that they misrepresented the actual scientific record. That they essentially said said, well, what happened was not really what reality was. And so they reduced the amount of uncertainty by throwing data out and ultimately changing the scientific record. And in effect, what they did was they created scientific, as far as I'm concerned, scientific misconduct. And so they misrepresented in the Journal of Science. And they did this for the purpose of trying to assure the public that they were on pretty close to the same page. And so they made their recommendation for LNT, and that recommendation for LNT will ultimately become the most important recommendation that goes forward, because it establishes LNT, and they were viewed as a dream team of geneticists, and their recommendation to go linear was a front page story in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and ultimately gets passed on to then subsequent National Academy of Sciences committee. committees. The story itself is one in which there are many other chapters to this. And what I think what I'm going to do is just drop down, because of the time issue, go down to a set of conclusions here, and I'm going to try to tell you essentially what I think the key findings are here, and in it, hopefully we can tie this together. And that is that Muller's gene mutation claim, in my opinion, is really now proven incorrect. That the LNT single hit model was really based upon Muller's incorrect interpretation. That Muller himself was deliberately deceptive in his Nobel Prize lecture. That Muller and Stern misrepresented the Manhattan Project findings to promote LNT. That the panel that I've just spent a lot of time on, the LNT panel that made the recommendation to go linear, they deliberately misrepresented the scientific record to promote LNT, and equally importantly, when they had the chance to use human data, 75,000 subjects from the atomic bomb blast study, they rejected it, would not give it scientific standing when it was given great scientific standing by the British, and reverted back to using the Delta Uphoff work as the basis for the LNT recommendation. This is passed really on to the whole sequence of Beer committees, the biological effects of ionizing radiation that we tend to work on today, and I'll pass on those details at some other point. But so why did LNT succeed? It succeeded because producing gene mutations was a major advance. This development really overwhelmed the field. Contemporary gene mutation criticism was strong, but neither side could win. And the Manhattan Project, though it had so much power and so much influence, and Stern just was driving, along with Muller, the LNT interpretation. Dropping the bomb frightened the world. The Nobel Prize gave Muller his platform, and its platform for his ideology. The Cold War had above ground testing, and this scared everybody. The Rockefeller Foundation created a separate genetics panel, and that was really key in this. And they stacked the deck. They stacked the members with those promoting LNT. The National Academy of Sciences is, one can bow to them and respect to appeal to authority, but they were steeped in ideology, and they participated in lies and deception in this recommendation process. The scientific community got the LNT question wrong, and self-interest and misconduct was also part of this, as although not part of this presentation today, much correspondence between members indicating that it was okay to exaggerate, because ultimately what that would do is raise public furor and would ultimately lead to more grant money for them. This is part of an academic game plan. And having been an academic for 45 years at this place, I understand the game of exaggeration, and it's basically unethical. All errors, deceptions, and mistakes were given a pass, and the scientific and regulatory communities failed in their oversight, review, and leadership. And my final slide here is that the entire regulatory programs and public education activities, in my opinion, are really based upon these and other deceptive historical practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Okay, I appreciate you plowing through despite the technical issues and presenting this important information. So thank you. Thank you. So maybe we can take a couple questions, but let's let people go to lunch. If let people go, there's lunch out there to grab. So please feel free to go out there and grab lunch, bring it back in. If there's a few people that want to ask questions while people are getting lunch, we can do that. Can you answer a few questions, Professor?
I can stay until the last person.
Okay. All right. We'll take some Q&A. I need to take the mic over to the Q&A mic stand.
Thank you. Ed, this is your Los Angeles compatriot, Jim Enstrom.
Hey, Jim.
I'd hoped to see you in person, but I'm glad at least I got to hear you and see your slides. My point is that in addition to presenting this talk, there's 3 groups that you need to go to. First is Science magazine, since you cited several papers that are wrong, going all the way back to 1927, if I got that correct. And this could be submitted in great detail, and then you pile up all the rejections you're going to get from Science. But do it anyway. And the second group is there's a current National Academy of Science panel assessing causality, and this is related to EPA regulations. And this panel would greatly benefit by your evidence on the flaws in LNT. And this is something that's currently ongoing. You can submit. I've submitted to this. In fact, I've submitted some of your work already myself, at least references to your work. And the third group is what's going on directly at EPA right now. They're in the process of trying to destroy a lot of the evidence that was accumulated in the last couple of years to leave the PM 2.5 NACs unchanged. And the current administration wants to undo all that by, again, making false claims about the validity of LNT and misrepresenting data. Many of the same things I'm dealing with are the exact same problems that you've uncovered. So anyway, I wanted to make this statement, and I want to commend you. There's not too many of us out there, and we've got to keep this thing going, or we're going to wind up losing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Ed, that was an excellent talk. I really appreciated all the information that, now it's my size. Okay. Just as sort of a point there, doesn't directly relate to this, but there is a very famous threshold effect in physics called the photoelectric effect. You would think that that might have somebody's interest in, yeah, there are thresholds that you have to do, and at least quantum mechanics believes it. Okay, that's all my comment.
Well, there's an overwhelming amount of data on the biology side, and it's hard to know what people who are in authority what they choose to look at and what they're blind to. I mean, this is it's a serious question.
Hey, great talk. Really enjoyed it. I am curious, based on our best current understanding, what's our understanding of the mechanisms that explain the non-threshold theory?
The mechanisms that describe
that explain the fact that there is a threshold, that it's not nonlinear, that it's not linear.
Oh, okay. Well,
double negative.
So the underlying mechanisms for why you might think that there would be a threshold.
Yes.
And I think that that's really tied into at its basic value, a basic understanding. It's really tied into the theory of evolution, and it's tied into trying to take a look at how organisms evolve in very stressful environments, radiation, but chemically challenging environments, and all different sorts, and and to take a look at the concept of repair mechanisms.
Mhm.
And upregulated repair mechanisms, and in a whole other area, not on LNT per se, but on this topic is I look at biphasic dose responses and low doses of all kinds of stressor agents, from physical to chemical, and really really independent of the cell type, independent of the endpoint you're measuring. You see that systems respond to low levels of stress with adaptation, and I think that's the bottom line here, and that is that if one wants to adopt an LNT perspective, in many respects, it's really an anti-evolutionary interpretation. These people have to somehow return to an understanding of some basic evolutionary biology, and this would sort itself out on an intellectual, scientific, and otherwise level. I mean, I think probably all these supporters of LNT, they left their biology training in the caboose because it's just inconsistent with how they've been educated. The only argument that I see them trying to use is because the mechanism argument doesn't really go their way, that they try to take a look at the occurrence of inter-individual variability, and they try to say, well, there's always somebody who's sensitive and within population heterogeneity, but even there too, and I have looked at those who have genetic predispositions, whether it's tied into DNA repair or many other kinds of things, you still find thresholds. They're more sensitive and they'll respond to a lower dose, but you still find thresholds even in those who are the most sensitive. So that argument is not persuasive to me to support LNT.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.